New York Harbor in the 1930s was America's postcard to the world. Streaked with ships, spiked with piers, bejeweled with bridges, and studded with American symbolism. Chelsea Pier, where the great transatlantic ocean liners docked, Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty. And it had the muscle to go with the image.
If you take it all of the docks, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Jersey, it amounts to 700 miles of docks, about 2,000 piers in all. And during these years, the 30s, the 40s, something like a quarter of all the American import-export business is flowing through the port of New York.
But the great harbor, with its sentinel of liberty, was also a bog of corruption. A criminal alliance ruled the docks, comprised of the mob, the ship owners, City Hall, and ILA President Joe Ryan. He was called King Joe on the waterfront, or Nickel and Dime Ryan, for the miserly way he doled out contract concessions to longshoremen. As the story goes, the shipping bosses would ask Ryan what he needed to keep the boys in line. Ryan would answer, "If they won't take a nickel, give them a dime." It worked. There had been no strikes on the New York waterfront since the end of World War I.
Ryan was told by his masters that they didn't want any strikes, and so, remarkably, for a quarter century, from the end of the First War to the end of the Second World War, there were no strikes on the New York waterfront, because the powers that be didn't want them.
Unlike his West Coast counterpart, Harry Bridges, Ryan lived the high life. He wore expensive suits, belonged to several country clubs, and threw lavish dinner parties that became famous both for who was there and who was not. Rank-and-file longshoremen were conspicuously absent, though they had been leaned on to buy expensive tickets for the dinners. Only the chosen few made it to King Joe's table.
People who were invited to those dinners was a who's who amongst the underworld, but also the political establishment of New York City, but also of New York State. And in a sense, that showed you the reach that Joe Ryan had.
Among the underworld's who's who was Albert Anastasia. Anastasia had penetrating eyes and a long history of mayhem on the waterfront. Back in 1921, Anastasia had been sentenced to the chair for murdering a longshoreman. But when the witnesses mysteriously changed their stories, Anastasia managed to walk free. By the late 30s, Anastasia had muscled his way to the top of Brooklyn's Mangano crime family. Fellow mobsters called him the Mad Hatter.
Albert was the toughest and the craziest. He had a reputation for just flaring violence out of nowhere, killing a man for no good reason. That was his solution to any problem. Clip him, clip him. So that gave him great power, great deference, because he was known to be crazy and a killer.
Under Anastasia's orders, Joe Ryan hired men with criminal records to work on the New York docks, just giving the boys a second chance, as Ryan would say. Except that in many cases, these ex-cons were Mafia soldiers whose job it was to steal whatever they could haul off the docks.
In a sense, it was a form of taxation by the union officials and by the mobsters, which was generally accepted by the New York Shipping Association.
The business was so lucrative then and non-competitive that the extra amounts of money they were paying in extortion to organized crime, in extortion to the unions, still allowed them to have an enormously profitable business.
Anastasia's brother, Anthony, ran the Brooklyn locals of the Longshoremen's Union. His nickname, Tough Tony, came from his years in a ship's hold. Tough Tony was a longshoreman through and through.
Tough Tony loved longshore work, the dead reckoning of how to load a ship, of where to place things so it was balanced right and you could get as much into the ship as possible. He actually worked on the docks and was a leader. I mean, if you looked at Tough Tony, you'd say, this man is a leader of men.
Tough Tony ran his docks like an old-fashioned padrone from Sicily. Longshoremen would have to pay tribute, as much as 25% of their salary, or they would never be picked out of the shape-up.
There's even an interview, if it wasn't so sad, you know, it would be hilarious, of a longshoreman who says, well, in the morning, the union delegate came around and I gave him a kickback. And then in the afternoon, another guy came around and he asked for another kickback. And I says, I couldn't give it to him. He says, after that, I haven't worked for 6 weeks.
And so it went on the New York waterfront. The mob controlled the rackets, while City Hall raked in the bribes and the votes, and King Joe and Tough Tony kept the longshoremen in line.